Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and I hope your holiday weekend was a happy and a safe one. Well, tonight, the Trump hangover, as well as the Republican Party. Now, Donald Trump, he's only got 51 days left in the Oval, which means he will soon be gone from the White House. But he will not soon be gone from our national politics. And even more, his influence may have over the Republican Party for years, impacting GOP lawmakers and the positions that they take, and by extension, it could impact our entire political system for years to come. Now, we're going to be speaking with two guests on what many would call the unwanted Trump influence. And also tonight, as COVID continues to spread out of control, new worries about getting people to take the coming vaccines. In fact, we'll open up our phone lines tomorrow and talk with you about that as well. Plus, we'll talk about a report inside one emergency room where people who are convinced the virus just a hoax continue to say and believe that, even as they're being hospitalized and even intubated. We'll also be having the very latest from our never-ending presidential election as Trump's recounts make his position even worse this weekend. And later, the latest in the runoff of elections in Georgia as more and more Republicans begin to identify Trump as a big obstacle in Republicans actually voting in that special election. But let's begin with the Republican Party's Trump hangover. Donald Trump, soon an ex-president, but his agenda and his assembly of grievances and his public support probably not going away anytime soon. And even when it slips from the front pages, his backers, they are leaning on new technology to try to keep it going and going. We're going to be speaking with an expert on that in a moment. But first, some background. And for that, we turn to senior political correspondent Andrew Whitman.
Well, Rich, no one watching tonight, in fact, no one in America would dispute just how divided our nation and our national politics have been in recent years. We had a razor-thin election in 2016 that ended up with Donald Trump in the White House, despite Hillary Clinton winning millions of more votes, and some fringe calls for recounts and investigations. The 2020 election was not as close, with Joe Biden winning both the popular and electoral votes, but this time, one of the candidates has been disputing the results. And while a majority of Americans say they're ready to move on with Joe Biden as president, we are still seeing scenes like these. Trump supporters gathering, claiming the election was stolen and demanding justice, and demanding the re-election of Donald Trump, regardless of how that happens. It's even beginning to affect Republican chances in the Senate runoffs in Georgia. This weekend, RNC Chair Ronna McDaniel was in Atlanta supporting the runoffs. She was asking for money when a voter channeled Donald Trump and asked why she should give since elections in Georgia are rigged.
How are we going to give money and work when it's already decided?
It's not decided. First of all, David Perdue still has 100,000 vote lead over John Ossoff right now with the certification. So if you lose your faith and you don't vote and people walk away, that will decide it.
More on that trend later on in the program. And it's not just Georgia. Trump voters continue to cast aside facts in favor of beliefs that validate what they already believed. More than 3/4 of Trump voters nationwide believe voter fraud is the reason Biden beat Trump, despite a lack of any evidence to prove it. 30% of Americans say they're not worried or not very worried about COVID, which has now killed 250,000 Americans and counting. And only 17% of Trump supporters say they do not believe in the QAnon conspiracy theory. And that information divide is leading to real-world divisions and problems as well. Everyone knows that President Trump has yet to concede his loss to Joe Biden and confirmed over the weekend that he will not concede. But a week ago, when Republicans began to pressure Trump to start the formal transition, it seemed as though the GOP, or at least its elected officials, were getting ready to move on. Didn't turn out that way. Here's Roy Blunt, a Republican veteran in the Senate, explaining why he refuses to recognize Joe Biden as the president-elect.
Well, the president-elect will be the president-elect when the electors vote for him. There is no official job president-elect, but I think I'm on a list that you're keeping at your network of Republican senators who haven't yet acknowledged that there's a president-elect, as if that's a significant thing.
Actually, Senator, it is a significant thing for official governmental reasons, but also just to show the nation and the world the continuity of our government. It's a phrase we used to say a lot in this country. But there may be another reason that Republicans are loath to cross Donald Trump. They need him, if only to help connect with his voters who continue to hold allegiance to Trump like they do not for almost any other Republican, which is why Aditya Chakrabortty recently wrote that Trumpism will continue even after Trump is gone. Rich?
Andrew, thank you very much. And to learn more, I spoke with Mr. Chakrabortty, who joined us from London just this afternoon. You know what? I want to read the first line for our audience just because I liked it, but also I think it sets it. You said, perhaps one day Trump will be dragged out of the Oval Office, his tiny fingernails still dug deep into that fat oak desk. But Trumpland, the country that ignored the politicians and the pollsters and the pundits that gave him the White House in 2016, will outlast him. And to that end, you focus on the population that supported him 4 years ago and again did largely this November, and that is downwardly white voters. And I'm curious, is it that they believe that finally somebody spoke to them, or that the messaging that their problems and their lot in life were the fact of others? And this grievance campaign, even if they didn't believe in QAnon, even if they didn't believe that COVID was a hoax, and even if they didn't believe the election was stolen, they liked the fact that somebody was blaming somebody else for what they were going through. That's
a great question. These grievances being really quite soundly situated in bad economics, in a bad economic situation for a lot of the people who voted for Trump, whether it affected they themselves or whether they could see it all around them in their towns and cities, that's really very powerful. So yeah, you're completely right, Richard, when you talk about QAnon being this weird conspiracy theory and all this other stuff about Trump himself being, a bit of a loudmouth. I've never yet met a Trump voter who claimed that they really loved Trump. I've met a lot of people who said, well, at least he says what he thinks, at least he's different. That style of politics might not be the one that the people that I've met would ideally have, but it's a hell of a lot better than what they've been offered so far, because at least it recognizes that they're in deep economic pain.
But what I was surprised about in November was there was a population that said, I got nothing to lose, in effect. And they voted for Trump in 2016 because of all the farcical promises they were going to get. But 4 years later, they were still in the same spot. In fact, a lot of those plants that Trump promised to open, they never opened, and some were even shuttered after he was elected. To that end, they can still see that the fat cats got fatter 4 years later. Why did they still say he's still a better alternative when evidence pointed to the contrary 4 years later?
There's a really profound truth in your question, Richard, which I just want to address briefly, which is you're dealing here with lots of people for whom politics and economics hasn't worked for decades. In that sense, if you put a cross in your box against this person or that person, it doesn't really matter, because you're still going to be served the same old crap day after day. And for those people, why not go for Trump? If you don't think the system's working, and if it hasn't worked for you for decades, then why would you not choose someone like Trump?
You know, I've been so wrong about the last two elections in so many different ways. But one of the things I found really curious is people want to compartmentalize, and I've been guilty of it too, who the Trump voter is. The ones that I know that vote for Trump, they don't have a white sheet hanging up in their closet here. They're not out and out racists. And I'm sure, yes, we can certainly point to the Proud Boys and the rest, but I believe that to be a sliver of the 40-some-odd% that voted for him. What I was surprised at, look at all the states that voted to legalize marijuana, that voted to legalize gambling. This wasn't so much a social referendum. Some want to have a return back to the 1940s maybe, but to me it's a much more complicated, breakdown as to why and why they felt so abandoned by the alternative and still stay with him. Is it as simple as he seems authentic because he says or tweets whatever comes to mind? Is it as simple as that?
In a word, no. There tends to be two schools of argument. One is it's all about economics, dollars and cents, and the other is just saying they're a bunch of racists and they're going to vote for people who channel their racist feelings. Actually, it's not as straightforward as that from either side. What you're looking at, I think, are increasingly pockets of voters across the rich countries of the West, whether it's in Britain, where I'm talking to you from, or America, where you are, who have been effectively cut loose from their political economic systems and don't think they work for them. Now, if you look at research in Britain, with our former coal miners. Our coal mines were shut in the 80s. And the communities that are left there have always tended to vote strongly for the left-wing party, for our equivalent of Democrats. And yet, increasingly, more and more, they're voting for the other side. They're voting for the right-wingers. And yet they show no real right-wing attitudes. It's not like they're into homophobia and racism at home, and that's why they're voting for the right. It's because they no longer trust the system. So they'll either stay at home, which is why the left lose a lot of those seats, or they'll go out and they'll vote for the other guy simply because, well, if I've always put all my money on red, why not go black this time?
You said that, speaking of Biden, and I was thinking of the Stout family that you had interviewed 8 years ago, and then reconnected with them, that, yeah, maybe Biden might look and sound more relatable than certainly Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago, but you called it laughably hollow, that this kumbaya idea that, hey, let's just all hand hands and everything will be all right. Is there, especially given the revenue shortfalls that every government's dealing with, U.S. certainly no exception, is there a model that, while it doesn't veer to socialism, that would be accepted by some of these folks who felt left behind, that would be passable in this kind of a political climate?
I think almost certainly yes. I mean, to take the Stout family that you mentioned, based in Pittsburgh, Mike Stout used to work in the steel mills. His daughter now works, well, she used to work in a hotel until they laid her off a year ago. And now she's sat at home working for a debt collection company. I mean, how's that for irony? What someone like Mike wants, he says to me, is fair wages for working people. And more money to be invested in the area that he lives in. You can put whatever name you want on that. It doesn't sound like socialism to me. It sounds like the kind of politics that America used to have in spades, you know, FDR and then the New Deal, if you like. My worry is that Joe Biden shows no real desire to go near that. I mean, he's the guy who started his campaign to be Democrat candidate by saying the system doesn't need radical overhaul. Well, I think what Trump shows you is it does need radical overhaul. And if Biden doesn't do that radical overhaul, you will get, if not Trump, you'll get someone who looks a lot like Trump and that acts a lot like Trump and sounds a lot like Trump and goes down just as well as Trump.
Well, it's a fascinating piece, and I think it really gets to the unresolved issues even after the election for so many Americans. Aditya, thank you very much for the time.
Thank you.
So if the conservative bubble around Trump is going to survive a Biden presidency, and that is definitely the plan, they're going to need to find new ways to communicate, especially as the media and social media platforms turn against the MAGA crowd by, heaven forbid, fact-checking. And the folks on the far right may have already found where to go next. It's called Parler, and after the break, we'll discuss what's happening there with a media expert who's been watching and worrying.